Blazing fires, deafening chaos, and a sense of raw desperation, all within the confines of one of the most secure prisons in the United States. For nearly 2 weeks in November 1987, the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary became the site of one of the most harrowing standoffs in U.S. prison history. Inside its massive walls, nearly 100 prison staff members were held hostage by a group of Cuban detainees whose anger had reached a boiling point. The riot would leave a trail of destruction, testing the limits of law enforcement and the fragile trust between detainees and authorities.
And you'll see that as this wall right here collapses on the rear portion of the penitentiary, that the fire just ravaged the buildings.
Don't know for sure what is going on inside. The latest is that negotiations are still going on. 4 of the inmates are negotiating for the 1,400 that are being held here.
The fire still burns out of control here, as you can see. Policemen ring the area. There are police helicopters that circle it as the fires burn unchecked.
They're going to kill everybody.
He's all right.
Yes, they will. They will.
This is the story of the Atlanta prison riot of 1987, an incident born out of years of neglect, broken promises, and a system stretched to its breaking point. In the spring of 1980, a wave of political and economic turmoil swept through Cuba. With widespread unrest and an economy in freefall, Fidel Castro opened the country's borders for the first time in decades, allowing thousands of citizens to leave. Over the next 5 months, more than 120,000 Cubans fled to the United States during what came to be known as the Mariel boatlift. Among those who arrived on American shores were political dissidents, families seeking refuge, and, according to U.S. officials, thousands of criminals and mentally ill individuals whom Castro labeled as undesirables. With no formal agreements in place to manage this influx, American authorities faced an immediate crisis. The U.S. prison system, already overcrowded and strained, became a temporary solution. Thousands of Mariel refugees were sent to federal detention centers while awaiting hearings on their immigration status. 2 of these facilities, Oakdale Federal Detention Center in Louisiana and the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, became home to the largest concentrations of detainees. To put things into perspective, at the Atlanta facility alone, over 1,300 Cubans were confined, many held indefinitely without trial or clear timelines for release. So, naturally, for years, frustrations gently grew among the detainees, fueled by this uncertainty and despair. Many had been held for nearly a decade without trials, hearings, or any clear resolution to their legal statuses. Promises made by the U.S. government to review their cases were either delayed or broken, leaving detainees to languish in overcrowded cells with little hope for release. The tipping point came on November 20, 1987, when the U.S. State Department announced a treaty with Cuba. This agreement would see over 2,700 detainees deported back to Cuba, many of whom feared persecution or worse upon their return. As expected, word of this treaty spread quickly among the detainees, igniting fear and anger. In Oakdale, Louisiana, detainees acted immediately, rioting and taking 28 prison guards hostage. The Atlanta facility, however, remained surprisingly quiet. But what the prison guards didn't know was that the quiet was deceptive. Within the walls of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, detainees were actually watching closely, organizing, and waiting. Tensions ran high as rumors circulated about their fate. At the same time, trust between detainees and prison authorities broke down even further. By November 23, 1987, just 3 days after the treaty's announcement, the silence eventually broke. Early that morning, detainees staged their revolt, and what began as an ordinary day in Atlanta quickly descended into complete chaos. Guards were overpowered, fires were ignited, and the prison erupted in violence. The pent-up anger of nearly a decade spilled over in a matter of minutes, marking the start of what would become one of the most intense prison standoffs in U.S. history. The morning of November 23, 1987, began like any other at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Guards went about their routines, staff filed into their stations, and breakfast was being served in the cafeteria. But something was off. The usual noise of chatter and clanking trays was missing. The cafeteria, normally bustling with detainees, was very, very quiet. Ted Maynor, one of the prison employees, arrived for his shift that morning and immediately noticed the change. The absence of detainees milling about the halls and the hushed atmosphere left him uneasy. Normally, it would be full of noise and activity, he later recalled. But that day, it was so quiet, it was unsettling. Elsewhere in the prison, detainees moved with a sense of purpose, but their intentions remained hidden. In the Industries building, where inmates worked on furniture and mattresses, everything also appeared normal. Machines hummed, tools clattered as usual, and supervisors kept watch as they should. Yet, beneath the surface, tension was unknowingly brewing. Remember, for years, these detainees had lived in limbo, and now, the news of their impending deportation had pushed them to the brink. Guards carried on as usual, unaware that this deceptive calm was the prelude to chaos. And by the time the first signs of unrest emerged, it was already a little too late for the prison guards and employees. In the Industries building was where it all began. The detainees there who were working on furniture and mattresses suddenly sprang into action, creating makeshift hoods fashioned from gray sweatshirts to conceal their identities, with eye holes crudely cut out for vision. Their plan was meticulously orchestrated, as one of the FBI agents deployed later had described it, and it unfolded in seconds. Guards stationed nearby were overpowered, and their radios and keys were snatched away. The first fires were ignited on the third floor, quickly spreading smoke and panic through the building. The roar of the riot grew louder, echoing through the stairwells as more detainees joined the fray. As expected, prison staff attempted to reach emergency phones, but the lines were cut short by rioters smashing equipment and tearing cords from the walls. Ted Maynor, who was also one of the few employees still trying to manage the chaos, was attacked as he reached for a phone. "He wasn't just trying to hit me," Maynor later recalled. "He wanted to stop me from calling for help." Within minutes, the unrest spread far beyond the Industries building. Smoke poured out of windows, and flames spread against the prison's towering walls. Guards and staff who were normally and according to the law of the prisons, unarmed and unprepared, were herded into cages meant for storing tools, and their captors remained armed with crude weapons made from scraps of metal and wood. The room was small, hot, and suffocating. As the smoke began to seep in, fear took hold. One staff member later admitted, "We thought we'd burn alive in there." The detainees used their stolen keys to unlock cell doors across the prison. Thousands of inmates flooded the halls, adding to the chaos. Some joined the rioters, arming themselves with crude weapons, while others simply roamed freely, unsure of what to do. Therefore, thousands of inmates, many hardened criminals, poured into the corridors, with their cheers and shouts amplifying the chaos. Some of the other guards in other parts of the prison, vastly outnumbered and unarmed with little chance of regaining control, scrambled to protect themselves. In desperation, some attempted to barricade themselves in offices and storage rooms, while others retreated to secure areas deeper within the prison, especially the hospital and cell block E. The carefully planned spark had ignited a full-blown inferno. Outside, the fire raged on. Observers in the prison towers provided a crucial lifeline, reporting on the growing violence and the locations of hostages. These early efforts to track movements and gather information would later prove invaluable. But for now, those inside the prison could do little more than wait and hope for outside assistance. Back in the prison, the fires set by detainees continued to rage uncontrollably and were now affecting everybody, including the detainees themselves. At this point, entire sections of the complex had been consumed, with thick, black smoke pouring out of windows and vents, choking the air and creating a hellish atmosphere both inside and outside the prison. The flames illuminated the night sky, drawing the attention of onlookers from miles away. Other prison staff who were now hostages were herded into isolated areas, while rioters continued to loot supplies, break into offices, and reinforce their makeshift defenses. The general prison population, now fully released, added to the unpredictability of the situation. The prison's towering walls, meant to keep inmates in, now served as a double-edged sword. The structure's design, with its high barriers and limited exits, trapped not only the detainees this time, but also the hostages and guards who had barricaded themselves in various locations. What this means is that they themselves cannot plan their escapes because the wall was just too high and other alternative exits were limited. Shortly after the riot broke out, Warden Joe Petrovsky from the administrative section of the complex, which hadn't been breached yet, placed an urgent call with federal authorities. The scale of the chaos inside the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was unlike anything the prison had ever faced. At that time, nearly 100 people were already taken hostage. Petrovsky knew the prison's resources were insufficient to contain the situation, so he turned to the FBI for help. Within hours, agents from the Atlanta FBI field office, led by Special Agent Weldon Kennedy, arrived on site. The FBI quickly took charge of the operation, recognizing the riot as both a crisis of public safety and a federal responsibility. Petrovsky briefed Kennedy and his team, providing an assessment of the riot scale, the number of hostages, and the detainees' growing control over the facility. As FBI agents and SWAT teams arrived at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, their first task was to establish a secure perimeter around the prison. The goal was clear: prevent the chaos from spilling into the surrounding community while containing the detainees within the facility's towering walls. Law enforcement positioned officers and tactical teams at key points around the compound. Observation towers, already manned by guards, became critical outposts for gathering real-time intelligence on the detainees' movements. Using binoculars, tower guards tracked groups of rioters as they roamed the yard, armed with crude weapons and makeshift shields. Reports of hostages being moved across the compound heightened the urgency of securing every potential escape route. Despite the prison's massive walls, concerns about breaches were ever present, especially since fires continued to rage, threatening to compromise the facility's structural integrity. Law enforcement fortified weak points and monitored areas where the flames came dangerously close to outer barriers. Helicopters also circled overhead, adding an aerial layer of surveillance to ensure no detainees could exploit the chaos to flee. Outside the prison, the growing crowd of onlookers, which were primarily family members of prison employees who were held hostage, media personnel, and concerned locals, presented an additional challenge. Authorities had to control the scene, keeping the public away from the immediate area to prevent interference with operations. Meanwhile, the press, eager for updates, captured images of smoke rising above the prison walls, fueling fears of a complete breakdown inside. By the end of the day, the perimeter was secure, but the tension remained high. Detainees continued to move freely within the facility, and their growing control posed a significant challenge for the next phase of law enforcement's response. So, with the perimeter secured by Special Agent Weldon Kennedy, he turned his focus to understanding the scale of the crisis unfolding inside the prison. Intelligence was critical, not only for locating hostages, but also for determining which areas of the facility were exactly under detainee control. Using binoculars and radios, the guards stationed in the prison's observation towers provided law enforcement with real-time updates on the detainees' movements. From their vantage points, they could see groups of rioters shifting between buildings, carrying weapons, and moving hostages to different locations. However, communication quickly became one of the most significant issues. The detainees had stolen radios from guards and were using them to monitor law enforcement communications. This forced the FBI to switch to secure frequencies to avoid tipping off the rioters about their plans. But this adaptation created delays in coordinating efforts across the sprawling command post and the tactical teams deployed around the prison. Inside the prison, detainees continued to expand their control over critical areas, including access points that could potentially be used for escape or sabotage. One of the most alarming developments came when detainees were spotted near the heavily fortified cell block E, home to some of the most dangerous prisoners in the facility. It was not until this development that Petrovsky and Kennedy discovered that 16 prison employees had barricaded themselves inside cell block E, What this means was that if the detainees could successfully breach this cell block, not only were the lives of these 16 prison officers at stake, but they could release the prison's most dreaded inmates too. Among them was Thomas Silverstein, a man infamous within the Bureau of Prisons for his unparalleled capacity for violence. Silverstein, incarcerated since 1975 for armed robbery, had earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous prisoners in the system. Over the years, he was convicted of multiple murders, including the brutal stabbing of a prison guard and a fellow inmate. His crimes and unrelenting hatred for prison staff led the Bureau to declare him an extreme security risk. If detainees gained access to cell block E and released Silverstein, it was feared he would escalate the violence further, possibly targeting law enforcement or taking additional hostages. To prevent this from happening, Special Agent Weldon Kennedy and his team immediately began to devise a plan to rescue the trapped employees without provoking the rioters or endangering the remaining hostages. One potential solution was to enlist Delta Force, the U.S. Army's elite counterterrorism unit known for its expertise in high-risk operations. Delta Force possessed the specialized equipment and training needed to breach the prison's fortified walls and engage in direct combat if necessary. However, deploying Delta Force posed a significant legal obstacle. Under the Posse Comitatus Act, the military is prohibited from active involvement in domestic law enforcement unless authorized by the president. While their capabilities were unmatched, using Delta Force in this context would have been a violation of U.S. law. This left Kennedy and his team with no choice but to rely on civilian law enforcement resources to carry out the rescue. With Delta Force off the table, Kennedy and the FBI's tactical team devised a bold plan. Using ladders provided by the Atlanta Fire Department, SWAT officers would scale the prison's 40-foot walls under the cover of darkness. To create a diversion, a National Guard helicopter would hover on the opposite side of the prison, drawing the detainees' attention away from the operation. Inside cell block E, the trapped staff waited anxiously. They could hear the rioters' attempts to break through their barricades and the threat of fire looming ever closer. Thankfully, the SWAT team climbed the walls undetected, secured the perimeter of the cell block, and evacuated the employees one by one successfully. And the entire mission was executed without alerting the rioters, ensuring the safety of the 16 employees. This successful rescue was a critical morale boost for law enforcement. However, the crisis was far from over. Elsewhere in the prison, dozens of hostages remained in the hands of detainees, who grew increasingly aggressive as the standoff continued. As law enforcement worked to maintain control outside the prison, a new threat emerged from under the walls. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was built with an extensive system of underground tunnels designed for utility access. These passageways, large enough for a person to move through, carried electrical lines, steam pipes, and ventilation ducts. But now, it seemed they were going to do more than carry electrical lines, steam pipes, and ventilation ducts. Reports began to surface that detainees were exploring the tunnels, possibly searching for an escape route or planning to sabotage the command post located near the facility. The possibility of detainees using the tunnels to smuggle weapons or launch an ambush heightened the urgency for law enforcement to act swiftly. The FBI's SWAT teams were tasked with securing the tunnels. Armed with flashlights and tactical equipment, they descended into the dark, narrow passageways. Communication with agents above ground was impossible, and the layout of the tunnels was unreliable due to outdated prison maps. Therefore, the teams were left to rely on their training and instincts to navigate the maze-like environment. In the dimly lit tunnels, as suspected on several occasions, the SWAT teams encountered detainees, sometimes within just feet of each other. These moments could have turned deadly, but each time, the detainees fled rather than engaged in conflict. The SWAT teams pushed deeper into the tunnels, determined to prevent any attempts at sabotage or escape. One particularly alarming discovery came when law enforcement observed detainees moving acetylene tanks toward the tunnels. These tanks, used for welding in the prison's workshops, were highly flammable and potentially explosive. If detonated, they could cause massive destruction, including the collapse of sections of the prison and the command post. Securing the tanks became a top priority for SWAT teams. To counter the threat, additional SWAT units were stationed at key points in the tunnel system. Teams from Chicago and Washington, D.C. were deployed to monitor specific sections, ensuring that no detainees could use the tunnels to carry out their plans. These efforts effectively neutralized the underground threat, preventing a potential disaster from unfolding beneath the prison. This decisive response marked another small but significant victory in the ongoing standoff. However, the FBI still needed to contain the situation, and to achieve this, establishing communication with the rioters was a top priority. Special Agent D. Rosario, an experienced FBI negotiator, led the effort to open dialogue with the detainees, but the first challenge was finding detainees willing to engage in meaningful conversation. Early attempts to make contact were met with hostility, as emotions among the detainees were running dangerously high. Many were angry over the shooting death of a fellow detainee during the initial chaos and viewed law enforcement as the enemy. Therefore, overcoming this distrust would be critical for the negotiations to succeed. Rosario's first goal was to lower the emotional intensity. "You can't reason with someone at that level of anger," he later explained. The team adopted a calm, measured approach, focusing on listening and demonstrating a willingness to understand the detainees' grievances. Gradually, a line of communication was established, and the negotiators began to gather information about the detainees' demands. Once communication was established, the detainees wasted no time outlining their demands. At the top of their list was a clear and unified grievance: the newly announced U.S.-Cuba treaty that would see over 2,700 detainees deported back to Cuba. Many feared that returning to their homeland would result in persecution, imprisonment, or worse. The treaty felt like a betrayal, fueling the detainees' distrust of the U.S. government and igniting their resolve to resist. Another major source of frustration stemmed from years of uncertainty and inaction. The detainees, many of whom had been held for nearly a decade, demanded fair and individual immigration hearings to determine their fates. For years, they had been promised reviews of their cases, only to face delays, broken commitments, and indefinite detention. Despite these clear demands, negotiations were anything but straightforward. The detainees, deeply mistrustful of law enforcement, were divided in their approach. Informal leaders emerged among the group, each vying for influence and control. This internal power struggle made it difficult for negotiators to identify a single voice that could speak for the detainees as a whole. Adding to the challenge was the detainees' continued volatile emotional state. Their anger and fear often boiled over during conversations, with threats against hostages and demands for immediate action becoming common. Negotiators worked tirelessly to de-escalate these moments, using patience and empathy to keep the dialogue open. For Special Agent D. Rosario and his team, these early discussions were as much about gaining the detainees' trust as they were about understanding their demands. By listening and responding carefully, the negotiators laid the groundwork for the more critical discussions to come. Now, while the negotiations were primarily focused on addressing the detainees' demands, there was another issue that needed quick intervention: Thomas Silverstein. For Special Agent D. Rosario, the presence of Thomas Silverstein within the prison was a problem. Rosario made it clear to the detainees that Silverstein was a liability, not an asset. His reputation alone heightened tensions, and law enforcement viewed his potential involvement as a major obstacle to resolving the standoff peacefully. The negotiator argued that turning Silverstein over to authorities would demonstrate the detainees' willingness to cooperate and improve their position in the negotiations. After much pushback, the detainees eventually agreed, but capturing Silverstein was no simple task. So they devised a plan to subdue him using narcotics. Knowing that Silverstein loved canned fruit, the detainees laced a serving of fruit cocktail with a powerful sedative. Once Silverstein consumed the drug-laden snack, he lost consciousness, giving the detainees the opportunity to restrain him without incident. Once restrained, Silverstein was dragged outside to the waiting negotiator, signaling their willingness to cooperate. This act was seen as a significant step toward building trust between the negotiators and the detainees. It also demonstrated that, despite their anger and frustration, the detainees were capable of rational decision-making. However, while things seemed to be progressing well with the negotiations with the detainees, an external factor threatened to undo their progress: the media. With the riot dominating national headlines, reporters descended on the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, broadcasting live updates to audiences across the country. While the coverage kept the public informed, it also created unintended consequences inside the prison walls. Detainees, many of whom had access to televisions, closely monitored the news for any indication of law enforcement's plans. The situation reached a breaking point when a local reporter misinterpreted a routine shift change among SWAT teams and announced on live television that law enforcement appeared to be preparing for an assault on the prison. This misinformation spread quickly, fueling paranoia among the detainees. They feared that negotiators had been stalling to buy time for a full-scale attack. The detainees' response was immediate and extreme. They dragged several hostages into the prison yard, doused them with gasoline, and brandished cigarette lighters, threatening to set them ablaze if law enforcement made any move to breach the prison. Special Agent D. Rosario had to act quickly to de-escalate the crisis. He assured the detainees that there were no plans for an assault and emphasized that progress was being made in addressing their demands. His calm demeanor and consistent communication helped diffuse the situation, convincing the detainees to return the hostages back to their cells. After days of tense communication, a turning point came when law enforcement identified a key opportunity: leveraging the detainees' informal leadership structure to influence the group as a whole. The detainees' leaders, though unorganized at first, had emerged as pivotal figures within the riot. Recognizing their influence, Special Agent D. Rosario and his team began focusing their efforts on building rapport with these individuals. They acknowledged the leaders' frustrations, listened to their grievances, and avoided taking an adversarial tone. This careful strategy began to pay off as the leaders showed a willingness to engage in more structured discussions. To reinforce trust, negotiators made calculated gestures. One of the most significant moves involved retrieving and delivering mail to the detainee leaders. This small but meaningful act provided a sense of normalcy and showed that negotiators were listening to the detainees' personal concerns. By humanizing the detainees and treating their demands seriously, Rosario and his team were able to de-escalate much of the hostility that had dominated earlier interactions. The breakthrough came when the leaders agreed to cooperate on two critical issues: the safe treatment of hostages and the surrender of certain high-risk detainees. This cooperation marked a dramatic shift in the tone of the negotiations. For the second time, with the first being turning in Thomas Silverline, the detainees demonstrated that they were willing to compromise in pursuit of a peaceful resolution. In turn, Special Agent D. Rosario and his team worked methodically to provide a framework for surrender, ensuring both the safe release of hostages and the peaceful conclusion of the standoff. Remember that the primary demand from the detainees was clarity on their immigration status. Many had lived in limbo for years, and they wanted assurances of individual hearings to determine their fates rather than being deported en masse under the U.S.-Cuba Treaty. Negotiators, recognizing this as the crux of the detainees' grievances, assured them that their cases would be reviewed fairly. While these assurances were non-binding, they were enough to convince the detainees to consider a peaceful surrender. The release of hostages was negotiated in phases. In a show of good faith, the detainees released small groups of hostages over several hours, prioritizing those who were injured or in poor health. As the process continued, law enforcement worked tirelessly to maintain the fragile trust between both sides. Any misstep could have derailed the delicate progress they had made. The final group of hostages, who were nearly 100 prison staff members, was released on the final day of the standoff. Exhausted but unharmed, they emerged from the prison to the relief of their families and colleagues who had waited anxiously outside. The detainees, in turn, began to surrender, walking out of the prison under the watchful eyes of SWAT teams and federal agents. The Atlanta prison riot finally came to an end after 12 intense and chaotic days. With all hostages released unharmed and the detainees surrendering, the immediate crisis was over, but the aftermath brought new challenges and consequences for everyone involved. As part of the agreement negotiated during the standoff, all Cuban detainees were granted individual hearings with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. These hearings gave detainees the opportunity to argue their cases for remaining in the United States, a significant concession that addressed one of their primary demands. However, the outcomes of these hearings varied widely. Some detainees were released and allowed to stay in the U.S., especially those who had not committed crimes or were deemed non-threatening. Others, especially those with criminal records or deemed mentally unfit, were repatriated to Cuba under the terms of the U.S.-Cuba Treaty. For the remaining detainees, their lives returned to the confines of detention facilities as they awaited further decisions on their immigration status. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos.